Los Angeles, June 25, 2009. I don't know how many people truly know the real story behind Michael Jackson's death. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories, falsified medical documents, or the incoherent speeches of desperate family members. I'm talking about what I saw, what I witnessed in the final hours of the life of that man, whose voice enchanted millions, but whose soul, it seemed, was on the verge of collapse. That morning, the city of Los Angeles seemed to breathe an unsettling calm. The streets were bustling with the comings and goings of ordinary life, but something sinister hung in the air, like an invisible shadow whispering to those who were paying attention. I was just an assistant at that time, a discreet presence in the shadows of the glamour and tragedy that surrounded Michael. I had been assigned to help organize the final rehearsals for the This Is It tour, something that was supposed to mark Jackson's grand return to the stage. But what I witnessed in that luxurious house in Holmby Hills, in the final hours of the King of Pop, haunts me to this day. When I arrived at the mansion, everything seemed normal at first glance. Dr. Conrad Murray was already there, pacing back and forth, handling vials, preparing something upstairs. I felt an unease in the air, something I couldn't identify, but that filled every room in that house. It felt as if the walls were breathing. There was a pressure, a kind of vibration that didn't make sense. Michael wasn't well. That was visible to anyone who had the chance to observe him up close in recent days. The fragility that his public appearance displayed was just a shadow of his true state of health. His eyes, normally full of a mixture of charisma and melancholy, now seemed empty, as if he was constantly looking at something or someone that we, ordinary mortals, couldn't see. As I walked toward his room that morning, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the kind of chill that comes from air conditioning, but something you only notice with the most primal instincts. A sort of presence, as if something was waiting or watching. I was supposed to go to him, deliver a paper about the week's schedule, but something stopped me from entering the room immediately. I stood at the door, hesitating, and that's when I heard the first strange thing. From inside the room, a low voice echoed as if he was talking to himself. I thought Michael was on the phone, maybe talking to the doctor, but the way he spoke, it was as if he was in an argument, almost like an angry whisper, but he was alone. I listened for a few minutes, trying to understand, but the words were confusing, mixing phrases about pain, peace, and something else that seemed completely disconnected. He mentioned a beast repeatedly, something like, "I'm not ready for you, and why now?" My curiosity turned to dread. Something was terribly wrong, and I knew that it wasn't just because of medication or exhaustion. I gathered the courage and knocked on the door. "Michael, is everything all right?" The voice stopped immediately. A deafening silence filled the hallway, the kind of silence that swallows even the sounds of the outside world. My heart raced in my chest, and before I could back away, the door opened slowly, with a creak that sounded more like the groan of something alive. Michael stood at the door. The image of him at that moment will haunt me forever. He was pale, paler than I had ever seen him before, and his dark circles seemed to sink his eyes into an abyss. But what disturbed me most was his look. He stared at me as if he were looking through me, as if it wasn't me standing there. His gaze was fixed, empty, yet loaded with an anguish I couldn't understand. "He's here," Michael murmured, his voice almost unrecognizable. "Who's here, Michael?" I asked, trying to remain calm. He just pointed inside the room. "The beast is here." The hair on the back of my neck stood up instantly. A strange smell invaded my nostrils at that moment, something that mixed decay with suffocating heat, almost like burning flesh. I looked into the room and, for a moment, thought I was seeing things. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, as if the room were alive, breathing, writhing. Michael closed the door before I could say anything, and the sharp sound of the wood closing echoed down the empty hallway. The smell lingered, clinging to my clothes, and I could barely think straight. That couldn't be real. I was imagining it. It was just exhaustion, or some residual effect from spending sleepless nights organizing the tour. At least that's what I tried to convince myself. I ran to find Dr. Murray, but when I got to the makeshift office he had set up, the doctor didn't seem surprised. When I mentioned Michael's words, he just shook his head, as if it was an insignificant detail. Murray's face was grim, and his eyes avoided mine. as if he was carrying a secret he couldn't reveal. He muttered something about exhaustion and stress, said he would take care of everything. He calmed me down with cold, professional words, but the unease in his expression was undeniable. Something in that house was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I returned to my desk, but my mind kept spinning. I thought about it for hours, until late in the afternoon when the news arrived. Michael was dead. The paramedics were called in a rush, but it was too late. The media exploded with the news, and chaos consumed the entertainment world. But amidst all the pandemonium that followed, one scene stayed with me. Michael's look and his cryptic words about the beast. That night, when I finally managed to pull away from the turmoil and went home, I was overtaken by a fear I couldn't explain. It felt as if something had latched onto me in that mansion, something I couldn't see but could feel. The smell, the chill, the presence, all the elements of that morning came back to me in disturbing flashes. I didn't sleep well that night. I dreamed of shadows dancing on the walls, of a presence hiding in the corners of my room. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was crawling under my skin. I woke up countless times, sweating cold, certain that every time I closed my eyes, I was being watched. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. The autopsy, Dr. Murray's trial, the press speculation, all of it seemed to pile up like a smokescreen over the truth. But I knew something beyond human comprehension had happened in that room. Something that transcended medication and physical breakdowns. I avoided talking about what I had witnessed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. Every dark corner, every unexpected shadow, I had the impression that Michael's beast hadn't stayed behind. One night, while I was alone in my apartment, I heard a sound, a low noise, like a growl coming from somewhere inside me. It seemed to echo through the walls, vibrating in the air around me. I tried to ignore it, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow in the corner of my room. It was there, standing still, as if it was waiting. The shadow I saw that night was more than just an illusion caused by the darkness. It couldn't be ignored, because it seemed to move unnaturally, crawling across the walls like a living entity. A chill ran down my spine, and the air around me grew heavy, hard to breathe. I froze, unable to take my eyes off that thing. It wasn't just a normal shadow. There was something there, something that was watching me back. My thoughts immediately returned to Michael's gaze and that terrifying word he had muttered, the beast. The memories of that morning in the mansion flooded back, now more vivid and intense. That feeling that something was lurking, something he feared and somehow knew was coming for him. But could it be coming for me now? Suddenly the growl I had heard earlier grew louder, as if it was getting closer. The sound was low, guttural, like an animal waiting for the exact moment to strike. I snapped out of my trance and ran toward the bedroom door, not looking back. My heart raced, each step echoing like thunder in my ears. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly, as if that could stop whatever was chasing me. But I wasn't alone. The growling continued, and this time I heard it clearly, as if it came directly from behind me. I swallowed hard and tried to stay composed, but I knew that this was beyond my control. It was as if the air in my house was saturated with something evil, something ancient, a presence that refused to be ignored. I sat on the living room floor, heart racing, and started to think about what Michael had said before his death. His words echoed in my mind like a dark riddle. "I'm not ready for you," and "Why now?" What did he know? What had he seen? I tried to connect the dots, but it seemed like every piece of this puzzle only led me to a deeper abyss of doubt. The following days were a constant struggle to maintain sanity. I kept working, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but I knew something was deeply wrong. The events of that morning at Michael's house and the night that followed in my apartment had shaken me in ways I couldn't explain. The shadows continued to follow me, as if the presence that had been with Michael had now marked me as well. The dreams got worse. Each night I relived that moment at Michael's door, but now in my dreams, the door would open by itself. I would walk into the room against my will, and the darkness would envelop me completely. In the gloom, I saw a figure, something that hid in the shadows, a crouching creature with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, watching me with a hunger that terrified me. I woke up sweating, panting, and with the sensation that something or someone was in the room with me. No matter how much I tried to rationalize all this, I couldn't shake the idea that Michael's beast had found me. It was then that I decided to look for answers. I began researching Michael's personal life, his beliefs, and his inner struggles. I discovered that he always had a complex relationship with spirituality and the supernatural. There were reports that he believed in forces beyond, in energies that influenced his life and career. Close friends had mentioned, in past interviews, that Michael felt he was being followed by something, a presence that had watched him since his youth. Something he couldn't explain, but that terrified him. As I delved deeper into these investigations, a disturbing truth began to form in my mind. What if what Michael feared wasn't just a metaphor for his inner demons, but a real entity? Something he had invoked, or that followed him because of his fame, because of his global exposure. I thought back to that morning in Holmby Hills. There was something in the way Michael acted, as if he knew his time was running out, that the beast was about to claim him. But what if it wasn't satisfied with just one soul? What if it was now coming after me? These thoughts consumed me, and I knew I had to do something about it. I started looking for help, but most people thought I was just paranoid, affected by the tragedy I had witnessed. Dr. Murray, of course, didn't want to talk about it. He was entirely caught up in his own trial, and Michael's involuntary manslaughter case had become the media's main focus. There was no room for conversations about something supernatural. But then, something strange happened. One night, while I was at home, I received a package. There was no sender, just a small sealed box left at my door. When I opened it, I found an old book, leather-bound, with pages yellowed by time. There was no title on the cover, but inside there were symbols and drawings I couldn't decipher. Along with the book, a small handwritten note. He always knew. The key is here. It didn't make sense. Who had sent it, and what was this book? I spent the next few hours flipping through the pages, trying to find some logic in the symbols and words written in a language I couldn't understand. But then something caught my attention. One of the illustrations showed a strange figure, a grotesque creature with claws and sharp teeth, resembling the creature from my dreams. In the caption under the image, there was only one word in English: beast. My heart raced, and for the first time, everything seemed to fall into place in a sinister way. Michael knew. Somehow he knew about this entity, and now I was caught in its web. After hours staring at that old book, feeling the weight of the pages as if they were made of lead, I began to realize there was much more than mere coincidence in all of this. The image of the beast in the book seemed to have been pulled directly from my nightmares. The crude drawing, made in harsh, dark strokes, showed the creature crouching, with glowing, hungry eyes that seemed to peer directly out of the page at me. But it wasn't just the illustration that disturbed me. It was what it represented. Michael Jackson, that global icon known by everyone, had faced something no one ever imagined. Amid his internal battles, drugs, and the immense pressure of fame, there was a darker secret he was hiding. Something that might have had its roots in those early days, at the height of his fame, when his image as an untouchable star dominated the world. But what if that fame had come with a price? What if the beast was the price to pay? That night, after absorbing all I could from that bizarre book, I lay in bed, but I couldn't sleep. The silence around me seemed thicker, heavier, as if it was loaded with something invisible. The wind outside blew gently, but every now and then I heard a faint growl mixed with the sound of rustling leaves. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching every move I made. The darkness of the room made me feel exposed, vulnerable. When the clock struck midnight, I heard a sound. This time, it wasn't the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. It was something real, something in the hallway, outside my bedroom door. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, slow, heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. My body tensed, my breath hitched, and a wave of terror swept through every part of me. Whatever was out there, It knew exactly where I was. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that maybe it was the old plumbing of the house, or some random noise, but the footsteps continued, and the familiar low, threatening growl began to fill the room again. This time, though, it seemed closer, as if it was right outside the door, waiting for me to open, to give it the slightest chance to come in. I knew I couldn't continue like this. I needed answers. I needed to understand what Michael had faced, what this beast was, and how it had become part of his life, and now, apparently, mine. I went to the book, frantically flipping through the pages, desperate to find something that could give me a clue, a solution. And then I found it. Among the scribbles and symbols, there was a passage written in English, something that seemed like a warning. The beast is not just a pursuer, it is the mirror of your soul. The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes. Face it, or be consumed. The message was clear, but fear still consumed every fiber of my being. How could I face something so monstrous, so far beyond my understanding? How had Michael dealt with it for so long? The answer lay in the subtext of what he had told me that morning. Why now? He knew his time was running out, that the beast was about to claim his soul. But what did this have to do with me? I spent the next hours sifting through my memories of Michael, trying to find something that explained what was happening. I began to remember stories about his fears, his eccentricities. Many thought it was just the product of the isolation caused by fame, by the extreme stress he faced. But what if these behaviors were symptoms of something much deeper, much more terrifying? Michael always talked about trying to achieve perfection, about reaching a sort of immortality through music. What if, at some point, he had done something to get that? As these ideas swirled in my mind, a particular memory surfaced. An old account, something Michael had said in an interview many years ago, but which now seemed to make much more sense than before. Sometimes when I'm on stage, I feel like it's not me, like a much greater force is with me. And sometimes, I'm afraid of that force. At the time, people took this statement as a reference to Michael's glow on stage, his ability to captivate the audience in a supernatural way. But now, in light of recent events, those words took on a much more sinister meaning. I needed to know more, so I decided to visit an old friend of Michael's, someone who had been with him since the early days of his fame and who might know more than anyone else about what he truly faced. Quincy Jones. He wasn't just the producer who helped shape Michael Jackson as the king of pop, but also a father figure in many ways, someone who knew the deepest secrets of his soul. Getting a meeting with Quincy wasn't easy. Since Michael's death, he had withdrawn from the spotlight, avoiding talking about the details of the star's personal life. But after much insistence and emotional pleas, I finally managed to arrange a meeting. When I entered Quincy's studio, a nostalgic air hung over the room. The walls were covered with platinum records, photographs of iconic moments from Michael's career, and posters from tours that defined a generation. But the man in front of me wasn't the same person I'd seen in past interviews. He looked worn out, prematurely aged, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. He looked at me with a serious gaze, with no hint of humor or patience. He knew why I was there. Without preamble, he asked, "You saw him too, didn't you?" The question caught me off guard. "You know about the beast?" I murmured, still trying to process the fact that Quincy knew what I was talking about. He sighed, ran his hand over his face, and then slowly nodded. Michael was haunted. It wasn't just the fame, the weight of responsibility, or the world watching him. It was something more, something he could never fully explain, but it was always there. He believed he had made a deal, and in some ways I believe he was right. My stomach churned at hearing those words. A deal? With what? With darkness itself, Quincy replied, his voice heavy with a seriousness that made me shiver. He was desperate to be the greatest, to transcend mortality, to leave a mark on the world in a way no one would ever forget. And at some point, he did something that allowed the beast to get close to him. He believed it was the price to pay for his genius. But in the end, he realized he had given more than he was willing to lose. Quincy continued, with a somber look I had never seen in his public interviews. Michael always sought perfection. He believed he needed something more, something beyond the natural talent he already had. And when you expose yourself to these energies, they find you. He was obsessed with the idea of immortality, of leaving an eternal legacy. But in the end, he discovered he had signed a contract with something he couldn't control. My mouth went dry as I tried to process what Quincy was saying. The beast wasn't just a metaphor, a representation of Michael's internal demons. It was a real entity, something he had summoned, consciously or unconsciously, in his quest for eternal glory. Quincy watched me in silence, as if waiting for me to ask the next question. But all I could manage to say was, "Do you believe it killed him?" Quincy took a deep breath, his eyes closing briefly, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. Michael was dying long before his body gave out. He knew that. That thing, the beast, had been feeding on him for years, sucking his life away little by little. Every time he stepped on stage, every time he sought that unattainable brilliance, he gave up a piece of his soul. And by the end, there was nothing left to give. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on for hours. I could hear the sound of my heart pounding in my ears, each beat heavy, like a clock counting down the last seconds before an even more terrifying revelation. Quincy's words swirled in my mind. If Michael had made a pact with this entity, with this beast, and it had drained his life until his death, then what did it mean that I was now feeling its presence? What did it mean that I was being hunted too? Why me? I finally asked, my voice faltering slightly. Why did this thing come after me? Quincy looked at me with deep sadness. Michael left you a burden, son. He tried to fight it, tried in every way to rid himself of this curse, but the beast is not easily satisfied. When he began to realize his time was running out, he did everything he could to shake it off. Maybe he saw something in you, someone who could carry on his fight. Maybe without meaning to, he passed the burden on to you. My body went rigid. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I didn't choose this. Neither did he, Quincy replied somberly. And now, you're caught in the same game. A tense silence hung between us. I wanted to ask more, to understand better what was happening to me, but I didn't know where to start. Quincy seemed exhausted, as if recounting Michael's story drained him as much as the burden of carrying this knowledge. What do I do now? I asked, desperate. How do I stop this? Quincy slowly shook his head. If there were an easy answer, Michael would still be alive. He spent years trying to figure out how to rid himself of that thing. He consulted mediums, occult specialists, tried purification rituals, but nothing worked. In the end, he believed there was only one way to stop it. You have to confront it. Confront the beast? The idea seemed absurd, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made sense. I felt its presence growing stronger, as if it was waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. Quincy stood up from his chair, his face etched with deep seriousness. You need to do what Michael couldn't. You have to face it and find a way to break this cycle before it's too late. Quincy's words echoed like a dark warning, a sentence I never expected to hear. He handed me the book that Michael had used in his search for answers, the same book I had mysteriously received days before. I didn't know how, but Quincy seemed to know that the book had found its way to me. Study it. There are things in there that might make sense now. But be careful. This isn't a game. Michael knew the risks, but even he went too far. I left Quincy's studio with a heavy heart, my mind spinning with dark thoughts and questions that seemed to have no answers. The cold night air in Los Angeles cut through my skin, but it wasn't the wind that sent chills down my spine. It was the presence I knew was following me, an entity that now seemed closer, more real than ever. I returned to my apartment with the book tucked under my arm, its weight feeling heavier than it should. As soon as I entered, I felt the same dense air, the same pressure that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. It was as if the very atmosphere was saturated with the presence of the beast. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I spent the entire night studying the book, deciphering the symbols, trying to understand the rituals Michael had followed in his attempt to free himself. Some passages were incomprehensible, written in ancient languages, but others began to make sense. There were mentions of ancient entities, beings that fed on human ambitions and desires, creatures that offered power in exchange for a soul. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. On one of the pages, scrawled in Michael's own hand, there was a note that seemed to be a final message. The handwriting was uneven, as if he had written it in a rush or under great stress. The message read, "The beast cannot be destroyed, only contained. It feeds on fear, on desire. But there is a price. To trap it, someone must take its place. Someone must take control of the pact." I could barely believe what I was reading. Michael had found a way to trap the entity, but the price was enormous. For the beast to be contained, someone had to take its place. Someone had to sacrifice themselves to break the cycle. My heart pounded in my chest. Had Michael tried to do this? Did he know that the only way to free himself was to pass the burden to someone else? Had he died trying to save someone? And now, had that burden fallen onto me? A low sound, like a guttural whisper, filled the air around me. I slowly turned, and in the corner of the room, I saw the shadow I had feared so much. It was there, standing still, contorting in an almost human way, yet grotesque at the same time. The glowing eyes, the same eyes I had seen in the book's drawing, stared at me. The beast had come. And now, I knew there was no more running. The beast stood there, in the corner of the room, watching me with its fiery, hungry eyes. The air around it seemed to vibrate, distorting the darkness that enveloped it. The stench of decay filled every inch of my apartment, as if its very presence was corroding the space, draining the life from everything around. And in that moment, I froze, paralyzed by the terror of facing something I could never fully comprehend. The silence in the room was almost palpable, broken only by the frantic beating of my heart and the faint growl emanating from that creature. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't run anymore. The beast wasn't something you could avoid. It was tied to me now, like a persistent shadow that would follow me until the end. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was a terrible truth I couldn't ignore. It was waiting for me to make the final decision. Michael's note in the book echoed in my mind. The beast cannot be destroyed, only contained. Someone must take control of the pact. I now understood what that meant, but understanding brought no comfort, only despair. Michael had tried to free himself, and in his search for salvation, he had discovered that the only way out was a sacrifice greater than anyone could bear. He had resisted until the last moment, but death claimed him before he could fulfill the final destiny of his pact. Now the beast was free again, searching for another soul to consume, for another being to trap in the endless dark cycle. It didn't just want to scare me, no, that would be too simple. What it wanted was to consume me, to devour me completely, not just physically, but spiritually. It wanted to drain the essence of who I was, just as it had done with Michael, leaving only an empty shell to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose. But something inside me still resisted. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe a desperate flicker of hope. I knew that somehow I had a chance, maybe a small one, but it was the only one I had left. I couldn't allow the beast to win. I couldn't surrender to it without a fight. If Michael, with all his fame and power, had succumbed, then what could I do to resist? But what if Michael had left the key? What if he had realized that I was the one person who could finish what he started? The book. The damn book. I turned quickly, my eyes frantically searching the pages, and my hands trembled as I flipped through each old, worn sheet. I knew the answer was there, buried in the lines, in the words Michael had scribbled as his sanity unraveled. He had left something for me, something I hadn't fully understood yet. The pages were covered in symbols, but as my eyes scanned the text, one specific passage seemed to glow, as if the book itself was guiding me to it. To contain the beast, you must understand its desire. It feeds on ambition, power, and ego. And when all of this is offered to it, it takes everything. But when confronted with the opposite, it hesitates. Ambition, power, ego. Michael Jackson had been the greatest of all. He had reached heights no human could have imagined. The entire world worshipped him, and with that, he had unknowingly fed this entity. That's what it sought. Souls that shone brightly, souls burdened by fame, success, and greed. But what was the opposite? What could make this thing hesitate? Suddenly, everything became clear. The beast fed on the desire to be eternal, on the fear of being forgotten. Michael, in his quest for immortality through music and fame, had opened the door for the beast, allowing it to enter. But what if? What if I did the opposite? What if I challenged it, not with power, but with humility? What if I offered myself, not as a sacrifice of ego, but as someone willing to surrender completely, not out of fear, but out of acceptance? That was the key. Michael had realized this too late, when his mind was already shattered by horror and anguish. But I, though terrified, still had this chance, perhaps my only chance. I stood up slowly, the book still in my hands. The beast remained in the corner of the room, its eyes fixed on me, as if waiting for my next move. I knew it could sense my emotions. I knew fear fed it, that despair strengthened it. And in that moment, I did something that surprised even me. I took a deep breath and relaxed my shoulders. It was no longer about fighting it. It was about accepting it. "I know what you want," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I won't give it to you. I won't fight." The creature's eyes flared with an intensity that nearly blinded me. The growl, once low and subtle, now deepened into something more ominous, more threatening. It moved toward me slowly, the shadow growing, spreading across the floor like a black tide ready to engulf me. "You want my soul, but it doesn't have what you're looking for. I'm not Michael. I don't want power nor immortality. I'm not famous, and I don't seek glory. You're wasting your time with me." The beast stopped. It hesitated. For the first time, I noticed a subtle change in the creature. It hadn't expected this. It hadn't expected someone to confront it without fear, without a desire to escape, but with full acceptance. "You follow me because I'm afraid and fear feeds you. But I'm not afraid anymore. I won't run. You can take me, but you won't get what you want. My soul won't give you what you need." My words echoed through the room, and the shadow around the creature seemed to waver for a moment. The beast stood still, its eyes now locked on mine with a fierce intensity. I could feel its frustration, its rage at not being able to feed on me as it had with Michael. It wanted something more. It wanted ambition, the hunger for power, the need to be eternal. But I had none of that. I took a step forward, feeling the weight of the situation, but also a strange sense of relief. "If you want to take me, but you won't gain anything from it. I face you not with strength, but with acceptance. You can't defeat someone who has already accepted their fate." The beast roared, a deafening sound that reverberated through the walls of my apartment. The shadows around it began to tremble violently, as if in convulsion. The pressure in the air became unbearable, but I didn't move. My feet were firmly planted on the ground. I would not be another victim. Then, without warning, the creature stepped back. The darkness surrounding it began to dissipate, dissolving like smoke in a wind I couldn't feel. Its glowing eyes still stared at me, but their intensity had diminished. It was weakened, and for the first time, I realized the beast could be defeated. It moved slowly backward, its form fading into the shadows of the room until, finally, there was nothing left but silence. The presence vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me alone, breathing heavily, but relieved. I had won. The house was completely silent now, and for a long moment I stood there, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The beast was gone, and with it, that oppressive presence. Michael Jackson had fought against the entity, but in the end, it was his fear and his quest for immortality that defeated him. He couldn't escape, but he had left me the clues to bring it to an end. I sat down on the floor, exhausted. The book was still open in my hands, and though I knew this story wasn't entirely over, for now, I felt free. No more shadows crawling along the walls, and the darkness was just that. Darkness. Michael had left a legacy, not just of music and genius, but of a fight against something much greater. He had faced his demons to the very end, and in some way, had helped save another soul from that destructive cycle. I could still feel the weight of the previous night on my shoulders, but for the first time in days, I slept peacefully.